Hello, everyone. I'd like to talk to you for a little bit about UWC-CSC's definition of learning. Now, our definition of learning states many things. We say that effective learning happens when it is purposeful, experiential, intrinsically motivated, reflective, evidence-based, and iterative. Now, though we have tried to give some helpful explanations behind that, it can be a little bit hard to wrap our heads around these things. And it gives the notion that these four things are separate, when in fact they're all part of a sort of coherent vision of education. And they might give us this underlying question of what all of this means. So, I'd like to break these things down in a slightly different perspective. Because the UWC-CSC definition of learning is really talking about two things: what effective learning is and what effective learning is not. It's actually kind of instructive to begin with what effective learning is not. Let's start with this little guy. You all might have seen him before. He's rather famous. Now, I think we can all agree that this is not effective learning. And clearly, I don't think many of you would try to, just shovel ideas into your head physically from a book in order to cram for a test. And yet, this behavior tells us something about this little man's notion of learning and assessment. In particular, what we learn, how we learn, and why we learn. And what we assess, how we assess, and why we assess. Now, I think that this little fellow is inadvertently giving us a nice indicator of the underlying ideas of the traditional model of learning. In the traditional model of learning, what we learn, well, it's formulas, names, dates, concepts or terms, yeah? And basic information. We learn a lot of information. And how do we learn this information? Well, we take that information from the book and we put it into our heads, however we can. Maybe not with our hands, but we read it and we attempt to memorize as much of that information as possible, as accurately as possible. Now, why are we doing all of this? Well, in the traditional model, the only reason we learn, really, is because there's going to be a test, and we want to pass that test. Now that brings us to our next aspect of the traditional model of assessment. What we assess in the traditional model is your ability to take those things from your head, recall them, recite them, and put them down on a piece of paper. That's all we're assessing, really, is your strength at recitation. And this has an influence on how we assess, because in the traditional model, all we're really doing is giving you the same sort of test again and again and again and again. And we give this same test to everyone, everywhere, no matter who they are, what they're interested in, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are. Because, well, that's fair, I suppose, but, and it is standardized. So this is how assessment is done in the traditional model, in a standardized fashion. And this gives us a clue as to why we assess in the traditional model. Because in the traditional model, all we're doing is seeing who's good at this and who's bad at this, so that we can rank them. That is the purpose of the traditional model, competition, to see who is most worthy of that slot for the college, who is most worthy of that high grade compared to their peers. So this is the traditional model in a nutshell, and we can kind of see how this might have led to this little fellow just trying to shovel information inside of his head in anticipation for a test. And I think that we can agree that while this might be learning, it's not really a very effective form of learning. Now that we've seen what effective learning is not, let's have a little look at what effective learning is. According to our UWC-CSC model, what we learn is not just information. Because we live in a digital age, and in this digital age, we have so much information coming at us, it's mind-boggling. We cannot possibly even begin to memorize all this information, and why would we need to? Because it's all available at the click of a button on the internet. No, what we need to learn is the ability to sift through all that information and find the underlying concepts within that information, the general concepts that apply to all information. So that's one thing that we learn. We learn concepts rather than particular information. Another thing we learn is how to find the relevant information amidst that massive pile of information. We call that research. We learn how to look at and analyze that information. We learn how to weigh different sorts of information and see what's the good stuff and what's the bad stuff, what's useful, what's not, what's reliable and what's not. That's called evaluation. Yeah? And finally, we want you to take that information that you've learned and evaluated and researched and apply it to problems, to challenges in the real world. That sort of application is super important in our model of learning. So, what do we learn in the UWC CSC model? We learn concepts, and you could call them competencies, which is a fancy way to say skills. That is what we learn in the UWC CSC model. Now, how we learn is also very different from that memorization model that we saw before. Rather than memorizing ideas, we want you to climb a mountain, do an experiment, make a piece of art. In short, have experiences. And once you've had those experiences, we want you to think about them and see what knowledge, what skills, what ideas, what understandings you can derive from them. We want you to reflect. So that's how we learn in this model, through experiences and reflection. And this gives us a slight clue as to why we learn. And this is really essential, because the traditional education model is all about poking you with sticks. You're going to get a bad grade, or tempting you with carrots. Oh, you'll get a good grade, and then you'll get a good job and a good college, etc., and a high salary. Well, what the science research has shown over the years is that sticks and carrots only work so long as you keep applying the sticks and carrots. As soon as you remove the sticks and carrots, the desired behavior stops. So, we're trying to find a way to get you to learn without extrinsic forces motivating you. We want you to motivate yourself. We want you to have your own goals, goals that you can apply to the world, that you can face all of those challenges that are coming up ahead of you in the world. So why do we learn? We learn for a real purpose, an individual purpose, something that's meaningful to us. Now this in turn impacts what we assess. What we're assessing in this model is your ability to take those concepts and skills that you developed and apply them to the challenges that come out of this world. So, what we're assessing is your competencies, your ability to use that information, to derive that information and use it. Now, this also impacts how we assess, because we're shooting for you to be able to address real-world problems and challenges coming from the real world. Well, the world throws out tons of challenges all the time, are constantly emerging, which means that one simple standardized assessment won't really cut it. We need variation. We need a variety of assessments to mimic the variety of challenges that you're going to face. And because each student has their own strengths, their own goals, their own dreams, and we want you to be intrinsically motivated to learn these things, that means we have to engage in some individualization in our assessment, give you some choices about what you're assessed on and how you're assessed and what you're trying to achieve. And this really brings us to our final point, which is why we assess at this school. Now, in our traditional system, the point of assessment was competition. But in this system, when you do well in an assessment, it's not to tell you, hey, you're smart. It's to say, hey, this approach you're using, it's working. So you know you have achieved mastery of this information, mastery of this skill, mastery of this concept. And when you do poorly, it's not to say, hey, you're not smart or you're not good at this. No, the point of our assessment and a failing assessment, when we learn from that, we learn this approach that I'm taking to learning isn't working. And your teacher learns that this approach that you're taking to teach isn't working. So that's why we assess. We assess to improve our learning and teaching. So when we put these things side by side, we really get a pretty decent idea of why we learn, what we learn, how we learn, what we assess, how we assess, and why we assess in these two models. And it is our belief at UWC-CSC that the models we have put forward are more effective. Thank you for your time. I hope you have a lovely day.